My name is Christine, and when I tell people my father once threw me out of the house, most of them don't believe me at first. They imagine a dramatic fight, some unforgivable mistake, or a rebellious teenager who just couldn't be controlled. But the truth is so much more complicated, and so much more painful. It wasn't just about the secret that I carried, it was about what that secret represented to my father, and how it exposed a side of him I didn't want to see. And before I take you any further into this story, let me just say, if you enjoy listening to real, emotional stories like mine, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so you never miss when a new story goes up, and of course, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means more than you can imagine. Now, let me go back to the beginning. I was 17 when everything came crashing down. Up until then, I had always been the quiet one in the family. I wasn't the rebellious type. I wasn't loud or difficult. I was the girl who did her homework, kept her room tidy, and made sure she didn't cause trouble. But I carried something inside me that I hadn't shared with anyone, not even my closest friends. It was a part of myself that I was still trying to understand, and I thought I had more time before I'd ever have to reveal it. But secrets have a way of finding their way into the light, whether you're ready or not. The night it happened, I can still remember every detail. It was late, the house quiet except for the sound of the TV in the living room where my dad sat with a half-empty glass on the table. I had left my journal on my desk, and I don't know what made him go into my room, but when I came home from study group that evening, he was sitting there, my notebook open in his hands. His face was unreadable at first, but when he looked at me, I knew. He had read everything. Every word, every confession I had only been brave enough to write down but never say out loud. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, like he was holding back a storm. My mouth went dry. I stammered, "It's just writing, Dad. Just thoughts." But he slammed the notebook shut, his knuckles white. "Thoughts? Is this who you are? Is this what you've been hiding under my roof?" I froze. I had never seen that look in his eyes before, disappointment mixed with anger, but also fear. He didn't just dislike what he'd read, he couldn't accept it. He stood up so fast the chair scraped across the floor, and for a moment I thought he might calm down, that maybe he just needed space to process. But instead, his words cut through me like a knife. "You don't belong here, Christine. Not if this is who you are. Pack your things and get out." I thought I had misheard him. My own father, the man who was supposed to protect me, was telling me to leave. I begged him to let me explain, tears streaming down my face, but he wouldn't listen. My mother tried to intervene, her voice shaking, but he silenced her with a look that made her shrink back. And so, with nothing but a small suitcase of clothes and my journal clutched to my chest, I walked out into the night. The air was cold, and my heart felt even colder. I had no plan, no money of my own, nowhere to go. I ended up staying with a friend for a few nights, but I could see the discomfort in her parents' faces. They didn't want to get involved in family matters, so eventually I found myself sitting alone at the bus station, wondering what would happen to me. I was just a teenager, and yet I felt like the whole world had turned its back on me. It was my grandmother, my dad's own mother, who saved me. When she found out what had happened, she drove 2 hours to pick me up and brought me to her little house in the countryside. She didn't ask me to explain myself. She didn't ask me why. She just held me and said, "You're safe now, Christine. You'll always have a place here." Those words wrapped around me like a blanket, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Living with Grandma wasn't easy, though. She didn't have much, and I felt guilty for being another mouth to feed. I took a part-time job at a diner after school to help out, and I worked harder than I ever thought I could. But through it all, Grandma never once made me feel like a burden. She would sit at the kitchen table every evening, sipping tea while I told her about my day, and she'd remind me that one day I'd be stronger because of this. Still, the wound from my father's rejection never fully healed. I carried it with me into adulthood, tucked away in the back of my heart like a scar that sometimes throbbed when the weather changed. Even after I built a life of my own, there was a part of me that still longed for his approval, for him to say he was wrong, for him to just call me his daughter again. But that call never came. Not for 15 long years. By then, I had managed to make something of myself. I had finished school, gotten a steady job, and eventually rented a small but cozy apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had built it brick by brick, with no help from him, no support from the family who had turned me away. I was proud of that. I had survived. And then, one evening, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, I froze. There, standing on the other side, was my father. His hair was grayer, his shoulders less broad than I remembered, but his eyes were unmistakable. Behind him stood my mother, wringing her hands nervously, and for a moment, I thought I was dreaming. My heart pounded in my chest, and I didn't know whether to slam the door or collapse into their arms. He looked at me, his lips parting like he was searching for the right words. And then he said something I'll never forget. "Christine, we need to talk." For a few seconds, I couldn't move. The man standing in front of me was both my father and a stranger. 15 years of silence stretched between us like a canyon, and now here he was, asking to come inside. My first instinct was to shut the door, to protect myself from the ache that had followed me all these years. But then I saw my mother's eyes, red, tired, and desperate, and something inside me softened just enough to let them step into my apartment. The place wasn't big. A modest living room with a faded couch, some plants I'd collected over the years, and a tiny kitchen in the corner. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and as they looked around, I felt both proud and exposed. I wondered if my father saw the independence I had carved out of nothing, or if he still saw the daughter he had thrown away. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "You've made a nice place for yourself." I crossed my arms, standing near the door. I had no other choice. The words hung in the air like smoke. My mother winced, and my father shifted uncomfortably, as though he had rehearsed 1,000 things to say but now couldn't find a single one. Finally, he sank onto the couch, resting his elbows on his knees. "Christine, I owe you an apology. No, more than that, I owe you the truth." I didn't say anything. Part of me didn't trust my voice not to crack. Instead, I sat in the chair across from them, my eyes fixed on his face, waiting. He took a deep breath. "That night, when I found your journal, I reacted out of fear. Not of you, but of myself. I didn't understand what you were going through, and instead of listening, instead of trying to be a father, I let my pride take over. I thought throwing you out would somehow fix things, or force you to change, or I don't even know anymore. It was the worst mistake of my life." My chest tightened. Hearing him admit it, after so many years of silence, stirred something I hadn't expected, anger and relief tangled together. "You broke me," I whispered, my hands trembling. "Do you know what it's like to be 17, standing outside your own house with nowhere to go? Do you know what it's like to feel like you don't belong anywhere, like the one person who should love you no matter what just decided you weren't worth keeping?" Tears filled my mother's eyes, and she reached out, but I pulled back. I wasn't ready for her comfort. My father lowered his head, his voice shaking. "I know. I replay it in my mind every single day. I see you walking out that door, and I hate myself for it. I thought I was being strong, but I was just weak. I let my fear and my ego drive you away." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "So why now? Why after 15 years? Why today?" My mother finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Because things have changed, Christine. Your father, he's not well. The doctors say his heart is failing, and he doesn't know how much time he has left. He wanted to see you before it's too late." Her words hit me like a wave. I looked at my father again, noticing the gray in his hair, the lines etched deep into his face, the way he seemed smaller than the man who once towered over me. For so long, I had imagined him unchanged, still strong, still stubborn, still the man who had thrown me away. But now, sitting in front of me, he looked fragile. Mortal. "I don't know what you want from me," I said quietly. "Forgiveness? A second chance? Because I can't just pretend the last 15 years didn't happen." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "I don't expect you to pretend. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I need you to know I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. And I need you to know that not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of you, wished I could take it back." My throat tightened, and I bit my lip to keep from crying. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand why he hadn't come sooner, why it took the shadow of death to make him reach out. But another part of me, the part that had longed for his love even as I tried to convince myself I didn't need it, wanted to believe him. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hum of my refrigerator. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me for years. "Do you regret me? Not what you did, but me. Do you regret that I'm your daughter?" His head shot up, his eyes wide with pain. "Never. Not for a second. I regret my choices, my blindness, my pride, but not you. You are my daughter, Christine. You always were, even when I was too much of a coward to say it." My heart cracked open at his words. I didn't know if they were enough to heal the wounds, but they were something. They were more than I had ever thought I'd hear from him. My mother reached across the table, her voice trembling. "We don't want to erase the past, Christine. We want to be part of your present, if you'll let us. We've missed so much, your graduation, your first job, your life. We know we can't get those years back, but maybe we can make the most of what's left." I stared at their hands, their faces, the weight of their words pressing down on me. For 15 years, I had carried the pain of being unwanted, of being abandoned. And now, here they were, asking to come back into my life. I didn't give them an answer that night. I couldn't. Instead, I stood up and said, "I need time." This isn't something I can decide in one conversation." They both nodded, understanding. My father struggled to his feet, and for the first time in 15 years, he said, "I love you, Christine." The words hung in the air long after they left. And as I locked the door behind them, I felt torn in two, one part of me aching from old wounds, the other part daring to hope that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. After they left that night, I sat alone on the couch for hours, staring at the spot where they had been sitting. Their words replayed in my mind over and over again, especially my father's final "I love you." Those were words I had begged to hear when I was 17, words I had cried for silently into my pillow at Grandma's house. Now, 15 years later, they arrived like a ghost from the past, almost too late. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw two versions of my father, the one who had stood in my bedroom doorway with anger in his eyes, telling me to get out, and the one who had sat on my couch just hours ago, frail and remorseful, saying he loved me. I couldn't reconcile the two. Was he both? Could I trust the man he was now, or would doing so only reopen wounds I had worked so hard to heal? The next morning, I drove out to Grandma's. She was older now, slower, but her spirit hadn't dimmed. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, humming softly as she kneaded bread dough, the smell of flour and yeast filling the air. Just stepping into her home made me feel grounded, like I was that scared 17-year-old again, finding safety in her arms. She looked up when she saw me and smiled warmly. "Christine, my dear. You look troubled. Sit down." I sank into one of her worn kitchen chairs, my voice heavy. "They came last night. Mom and Dad." Her hands froze mid-knead, and she studied me carefully. "And how did it go?" I let out a shaky laugh. "I don't even know. They said they're sorry. Dad said he regrets everything, that he's sick and doesn't know how much time he has left. He told me he loves me." Grandma wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from me, her eyes soft but steady. "And how did that make you feel?" That question broke something open inside me. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I whispered, confused. Angry. Relieved. All of it at once. I wanted to slam the door in their faces, but I also wanted to hug them. I've waited so long for those words, but now I don't know if I can believe them. She reached across the table and took my hands. "Christine, forgiveness isn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about deciding whether you want to carry the pain or put it down. The question isn't whether your father deserves forgiveness, it's whether you deserve peace." Her words sat heavy on my chest. She was right, of course. I had carried this wound for 15 years, and it had shaped so much of who I was. But was I ready to let it go? Later that evening, I went back home and sat by the window with my journal, the same one that had started everything all those years ago. The pages were worn, filled with my teenage handwriting, my secrets, my pain. I flipped through them slowly, remembering how lost I had been, how desperately I had wanted to be seen. And now, after all this time, my father had finally seen me. But was it too late? Days turned into weeks. My parents called a few times, but I let the calls go to voicemail. Each message was the same, my mother's voice gentle, asking how I was, saying they hoped we could talk again soon. My father's voice weaker, quieter, simply saying he loved me. I avoided responding because I didn't know what I would say. Some nights, I convinced myself that letting them back in would only reopen the pain. Other nights, I wondered if I would regret staying silent once my father was gone. That thought haunted me the most, regret. One Saturday afternoon, I went for a walk in the park near my apartment. The air was crisp, children played on the swings, and couples strolled hand in hand. Watching them stirred something inside me, a reminder of what I had always wanted, a family where love was steady and unconditional, where mistakes were acknowledged and repaired instead of hidden. I sat on a bench, staring at the pond, when an older woman with kind eyes sat beside me. She glanced at me for a moment, then said, "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." Normally, I wouldn't open up to a stranger, but something about her felt safe. So I said quietly, "My father hurt me years ago. Threw me out. And now, after all this time, he wants back into my life. I don't know if I can let him." She nodded thoughtfully. "You don't owe anyone forgiveness, dear. But if you want to heal, sometimes forgiving is more for you than for them. Just don't wait too long. Time is a thief, and it takes people before we're ready." Her words echoed Grandma's, and they followed me home that night. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of a decision. That week, I finally answered one of my mother's calls. Her voice trembled with relief when she heard mine. "Christine? Oh, thank God. How are you?" I hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking. About everything. About Dad. About the past. I'm not ready to forgive, not yet. But I'm willing to talk. In person." She started to cry softly. "That's all we want, sweetheart. Just a chance to talk. Thank you." 2 days later, I found myself driving to their house, the same house I had left with a suitcase in my hand 15 years ago. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I pulled into the driveway. Everything looked the same, yet so different. The paint was more faded, the garden less tended, the house quieter. When my mother opened the door, she pulled me into a hug before I could react. For a moment, I stiffened, but then I let myself sink into it, just a little. Inside, I found my father sitting in his recliner, a blanket over his legs, his face pale and tired. He looked up at me with eyes that held both sorrow and hope. "Christine," he said softly, his voice weak but clear. "Thank you for coming." And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. But I also knew that I was ready to at least try. When I stepped further into the living room, I noticed how small my father seemed now. The man who once towered over me with anger in his eyes was shrunken in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the blanket. For a moment, I just stood there, staring, unable to move closer. My mother motioned toward the couch, and I finally sat down, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against my chest. He cleared his throat, his voice raspy. "Christine, there are so many things I wish I could take back. Not a day goes by that I don't think about that night. The way I threw you out. I've replayed it 1,000 times in my head. I was wrong. I was so wrong." I wanted to scream at him, to ask why he had chosen pride over love, why he hadn't chased after me when I left, why it took 15 years and failing health for him to face me. Instead, I just whispered, "Why?" My voice cracked under the weight of that one word. His eyes filled with tears, and he looked down at his hands. "Because I was a coward. because I cared more about appearances than my own daughter's heart. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that I was teaching you a lesson. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what people would say. Afraid of losing control. And in the process, I lost you. I felt hot tears sting my eyes, anger and sorrow mixing together. Do you even realize what you did to me? Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep at Grandma's, wondering why I wasn't enough for you to love? He lifted his head, his voice shaking. I do now. And it breaks me. Christine, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for a chance to make things right before it's too late. My mother, sitting quietly beside him, placed her hand on his arm and then looked at me. We failed you, Christine. I failed you too. I should have stood up for you, should have fought harder. But I stayed silent, and that silence hurt you just as much as his words did. I regret it every day. Hearing her admit it made my chest tighten. For years, I had pictured her as complicit, as someone who had chosen him over me. Now she was sitting there, tears in her eyes, finally acknowledging what I had always felt. I don't know if I can just forget, I said quietly. 15 years is a long time. I built a life without you. I learned to survive without your love. My father nodded, his expression solemn. I don't expect you to forget. I just want the chance to show you that I can be different. Even if we don't have much time left together, I want to spend it making sure you know that you were always enough. It was me who failed, not you. Those words cut straight through me. All the years of wondering if I wasn't worthy of love, all the doubt that had followed me into every relationship, every decision, it wasn't about me at all. It had been his weakness, his pride. For the first time, I saw it clearly. I leaned back on the couch, exhausted from the flood of emotions. Part of me wanted to stay angry, to protect myself from more disappointment. But another part of me, the part that still remembered being his little girl before everything fell apart, longed to believe him. We sat there for hours, talking in fits and starts. He told me about his health, about how the diagnosis had forced him to confront the choices he had made. He admitted that every milestone he had missed, my graduation, my first job, even the times he had driven past Grandma's house but couldn't bring himself to knock, haunted him. I told him about my life, about the struggles and triumphs, about how Grandma had been my anchor when they weren't there. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told them about the nights I felt abandoned, about the walls I had built around my heart, about the way I had taught myself not to expect anything from them. My mother cried openly, and my father sat with tears silently rolling down his cheeks. At one point, he reached out his hand, trembling, and asked softly, "Would it be all right if I held your hand? Just for a moment?" I froze, staring at his hand. It seemed so small, so fragile compared to the memory of the man who had once pointed toward the door and told me to leave. Slowly, I placed my hand in his. His grip was weak, but it was filled with a desperation I had never seen in him before. "I'm sorry, Christine," he whispered again, his voice breaking. "For everything." For the first time in 15 years, I didn't pull away. Later that evening, when I finally drove home, my mind was a storm of emotions. I didn't know what would come next, but something inside me had shifted. The walls weren't gone, but maybe, just maybe, a door had cracked open. That night, as I sat in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that the decision I had been wrestling with for weeks wasn't just about whether I could forgive them, it was about whether I could allow myself to heal. Forgiveness didn't mean erasing the past. It meant releasing myself from carrying it forever. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to take that step. The days after that visit were some of the strangest of my life. For so many years, my parents had been like ghosts to me, people I knew existed but kept tucked away in the corners of my mind, too painful to look at directly. Now suddenly, they were calling, texting, trying to check in. At first, I didn't even know how to respond. I would see my mother's name flash on the screen and just stare at it, my thumb hovering over decline. Part of me wanted to send them right back into the silence they had left me in. But another part of me, the part that still remembered being a child wanting their approval, whispered that maybe I should give them a chance. I started small. A few text messages, a short phone call where we mostly talked about the weather, nothing deep. But the way my father's voice lit up just hearing me say hello, it did something to me. He sounded fragile, but also hopeful, like every word was a gift he didn't think he'd get again. I found myself agreeing to visit once a week. At first, I told myself it was just to see how serious they were, to make sure this wasn't just another performance. But the truth was, I needed those visits too, though I would never have admitted it back then. One Sunday afternoon, I walked into their house and found my father sitting in his recliner, a blanket tucked around his legs, a stack of photo albums spread out on the coffee table. When he saw me, he smiled in a way that made him look years younger. "Christine," he said softly, "I was hoping you'd help me go through these. I realized I never showed you the pictures from when I was your age." I hesitated, then sat down across from him. My mother brought us tea and quietly left the room, giving us space. As he flipped through the pages, he told me stories I had never heard before, about his first job, the beat-up car he bought with his savings, the day he asked my mother to marry him. I listened, trying to reconcile this gentle man with the one who had once turned me away. Then, almost shyly, he turned to a page filled with pictures of me as a child. My first birthday, me in a frilly pink dress, frosting smeared across my face. Me at 5 years old, holding a stuffed bear almost as big as I was. Him carrying me on his shoulders at the park. I felt my throat tighten as he touched one of the photos with trembling fingers. "I thought I had more time," he whispered. "More time to be the father you deserved. I wasted it. And now all I have are these pictures and regrets." I blinked back tears, my voice barely audible. "You could have chosen differently. You could have loved me through my mistakes instead of throwing me out." His eyes met mine, filled with a sorrow so raw it nearly broke me. "You're right. And I will never forgive myself for that. But if you'll let me, I want to make whatever time I have left about you. About us." For the first time, I didn't immediately push back. I simply nodded, and that small gesture seemed to fill him with relief. Over the next few months, those visits became a routine. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we just sat quietly, watching old movies or sharing a meal my mother had prepared. Slowly, I began to notice changes in her too. She no longer avoided difficult conversations. She asked me about my life, really asked, not just in passing. She apologized more than once, not with excuses, but with honesty. And little by little, I felt some of the bitterness I had carried for so long begin to loosen its grip on me. But healing was not a straight line. There were days I left their house angry all over again, triggered by a careless word or the memory of how easily they had once let me go. One evening, after a particularly emotional visit, I sat in my car outside their house, gripping the steering wheel and sobbing. I hated how much power they still had over me, how much I still craved their love even after everything. But underneath all that pain, I also felt something else, something like hope. The turning point came one spring afternoon when I arrived to find my father sitting on the porch, his oxygen tank beside him, the sunlight making his silver hair glow. He looked frail, but when he saw me, he smiled as though I had brought the whole world with me. "Christine," he said, reaching for my hand as I sat beside him, "I want to tell you something important. I don't know how much time I have left, but I need you to know this before I go." I held my breath, my heart pounding. "You are the best thing I ever had," he said, his voice breaking. "I was blind to it for too long, but you were always my pride. I didn't say it when I should have, and I will never stop regretting that. But if you take anything from me when I'm gone, let it be this: you were never the problem. I was. And I am so proud of the woman you've become." Tears blurred my vision, and I couldn't stop them even if I wanted to. I leaned my head against his shoulder, something I hadn't done since I was a child, and whispered, "I needed to hear that." We sat there in silence, holding on to each other, the years of distance slowly melting away. For the first time in so long, I felt like his daughter again. That evening, as I drove home, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't hurt. It was about choosing to no longer let that hurt define every part of me. My father's words didn't undo the pain, but they gave me something I thought I had lost forever: peace. The weeks that followed that spring afternoon felt like borrowed time. Every visit to my parents' house became more precious, every conversation a little more fragile. I found myself memorizing the sound of my father's laugh, the way my mother hummed softly while cooking, the simple routines that once felt so ordinary but now carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I knew his health was failing. I could see it in the way he tired more quickly, in the pauses between his words when his breath caught, in the quiet resignation in my mother's eyes as she adjusted his oxygen. Still, I held on to the hope that we had more days, more moments to repair what was broken. One evening, I brought over a homemade meal. It wasn't fancy, just a casserole I had thrown together, but when I set it on the table, my father smiled as if it were a feast. "You've become such a strong woman," he said between bites. "Independent, kind, resilient." I don't know how much of that came from us, but I want to believe a piece of it did. I looked at him, my throat tightening. "Grandma had a lot to do with it," I admitted, my voice soft. "But maybe some of it did come from you. Maybe it's why I still wanted you to be proud of me all these years." He reached across the table, his hand shaky but firm enough to squeeze mine. "I am proud, Christine. More than I can say." That night, as I drove home, I thought about the strange twists of life. 15 years ago, I had walked away from this house in pain, carrying nothing but my own determination to survive. Now I was walking back in, piece by piece, and though the scars were still there, something new was blooming in their place: acceptance. Then came the night when my phone rang, and my mother's trembling voice said only 3 words: "It's time, Christine." I drove faster than I should have, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I arrived, the house was quiet, the air heavy. My father was lying in his bed, his breath shallow, his eyes closed. My mother sat beside him, holding his hand, tears streaking her face. When she saw me, she whispered, "He's been waiting for you." I knelt by his bedside, taking his other hand into mine. His eyes fluttered open, and when he saw me, he smiled faintly. "Christine," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you came." "I'm here, Dad," I said, choking back sobs. "I'm not leaving." He squeezed my hand weakly. "Thank you for giving me another chance, for letting me love you again." Tears streamed down my face as I leaned closer. "Thank you for finally seeing me. I forgive you, Dad. I really do." His eyes glistened, and with what little strength he had left, he whispered, "That means everything." "I love you, Christine." "I love you too," I whispered back. Moments later, his chest rose one final time, and then he was still. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy with finality, but also filled with something unexpected, peace. I cried into my mother's arms that night, both of us mourning the years lost and grateful for the ones we had reclaimed at the end. For the first time, I saw her not just as the woman who had stayed silent, but as someone who had carried her own share of pain and was now trying, like me, to heal. The days after his passing were a blur of arrangements and condolences, but through it all, one thought remained clear: I had said what I needed to say. I had told him I forgave him. I had told him I loved him. And I had heard the words I had been waiting for all my life, that I was enough, that he was proud. Standing at his graveside, the spring air warm against my face, I felt something lift inside me. Not the grief, it was heavy and real, but the weight of the anger I had carried for 15 years. It no longer controlled me. After the service, my mother took my hand. "Christine," she said softly, "I don't want to lose you again. I know I can't change the past, but can we try to build something new? Just you and me?" I looked at her, at the lines etched into her face, at the sorrow and sincerity in her eyes. For so long, I had pushed her away along with him, blaming her for standing by silently. But now, I saw the courage it took for her to admit her failures and to still reach for me. "Yes," I said finally. "We can try." And we did. It wasn't perfect. Nothing could erase the years we lost, but slowly, we found a rhythm. We cooked together, went for walks, shared stories we had never told before. I learned that forgiveness wasn't a single act but a choice I had to make again and again, every time the past tried to creep back in. One afternoon, months later, I found myself standing in my living room, looking at an old photo of my father holding me as a baby. For the first time in years, I didn't feel just pain when I looked at it. I felt love. Complicated, messy, imperfect love, but love all the same. 15 years earlier, my father had thrown me out over a secret, and I had built my life without him. But when he came to my door, frail and repentant, I had a choice: to keep carrying the bitterness, or to open the door and let healing begin. I chose healing. And though our time together was short in the end, it was enough to remind me that sometimes, closure doesn't come from the apologies we never got when we needed them. It comes from the strength to accept the ones we get later and to let them be enough. As I sat quietly that evening, the sun setting through my window, I whispered a final goodbye into the fading light. "I love you, Dad. And I'm going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it.